Welcome to the Brainbox podcast. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that brings humanities scholarship to the general public. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. Brainbox is a podcast for your noggin. It's meant to challenge our on-air guests to make the humanities relevant to today and challenge listeners to use their Brainbox to make better sense of current events. We talk to experts in humanities fields like history, philosophy, literature, and ethics who give informed views on the deeper historical and cultural context of world events. You can find all of our previous episodes, and you can comment about what you've heard by going to our website, okhumanities.org/brainbox. And you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting libraries. You can email us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. In this episode, we'll be talking about the powers of the American presidency. Some recent research indicates that the first person that most American children remember, beyond their immediate circle of family and friends, is the President of the United States. It's commonly said that the person holding this office is the leader of the free world and the most powerful person in the world. Did the founders of the United States intend to create such a powerful presidency? And how has the presidency evolved over the last 230 years? And how might it change in the future? Our guests are Dr. Aaron Mason and Dr. Eric Schmaltz. Dr. Aaron Mason is professor of political science at Northwestern Oklahoma State University in Alva. He received his PhD from Northern Arizona University in 2006. He's published articles on American Indian tribal governments and state government interaction, as well as issues dealing with the Founding Fathers and the U.S. Constitution. Dr. Eric Schmaltz is a professor of history at Northwestern Oklahoma State University. In the summer of 2019, he began serving as the departmental chair of social sciences. Along with Dr. Mason, Dr. Schmaltz is both co-founder and co-director of Northwestern's Endowed Institute for Citizenship Studies and co-editor of its journal, Civitas. So welcome, Aaron and Eric.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for driving all the way to Oklahoma City from Alva. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So the founders invented this office of the presidency. How do they view this presidency? What influenced the way they shaped the creation of this office?
Well, Dr. Mason, I'll let you start as the political scientist.
Well, first and foremost, they were students of history. They were extremely well versed in philosophy. They call it natural philosophy in those days. Heavily influenced by people like Locke, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. And I always tell students that we're very fortunate that the founders, with all of the shortcomings that they had, and there certainly are some, that they didn't go too far one way or the other. But in terms of Lockean thought, where you just throw the perspective is you throw off all restraints and you don't put any restraints on people, versus Hobbesian government where you're constantly on people and you're authoritarian. They took kind of a middle approach. And of course, some of the founders, again, kind of say this middle approach, some of them were opposed to an executive altogether. And when you think of the creation of the Constitution, which produced Article 2 of the Constitution, of course, you also have to think of the ratifying conventions. And so you think of figures like Patrick Henry. He wasn't particularly supportive of the Constitution anyway, and he certainly was not wanting to have any type of strong executive. And then at the other side of that, you have Hamilton, and you have the strong Federalists who are clearly advocating for that. And so, to answer the question, we've got from the very beginning in America, you've got something to suit everybody. You've got, and a lot of the same discussions and controversies that exist today existed then. So, some of them wanted a strong president, Hamilton, even Adams, others, Patrick Henry, even Jefferson, who wasn't even there at the Constitutional Convention. He was very dubious about what a president might accomplish. Of course, when he became president, he expected everyone to fall in line and do what he said.
Yeah, we're going to see a lot of that, I think, in this.
And there was even, during the debates in Philadelphia, of having multiple presidents, too, and or even having one president handle domestic affairs and another handle foreign affairs. It's kind of like co-emperors in the Roman Empire, delegating authority. So, there were a lot of different perspectives. It is a very diverse group. You had lawyers, farmers, merchants. You had, again, there really are products of the Enlightenment tradition. They might be one of the great generations in terms of educational background and attainment. And most of these men were relatively young men, too. We always think of these older, we think of the dollar bills, and, or of course, Franklin wasn't a president, but, these old men, most of them were in their 30s and 40s in their prime, up and coming. He did have a few older, like Washington, and then in Franklin and a few others. But
they're different generations.
Yeah, but they're definitely a product of the Enlightenment. And one thing I always like to point out to my students as a student of history, remember they come from a very diverse society, especially the Mid-Atlantic states, the different religious denominations, the different ethnic groups that had migrated or had been absorbed into the English colonies, like the Dutch, and then a few others, the Germans, and then of course from the British Isles themselves, a lot of variety. But one thing about them, they were very sensitive about that religious pluralism, and that shaped also their views on organized religion and government's relationship with religion. And I always tell my students they're only about 150 years after the last great war of religion. It's still kind of in the background, right? The 30 Years' War. That was 1648, so we're 140 years after that. Still very sensitive, and plus some of the conflicts in England that resulted from the Reformation. So they were very aware of it. So they're part of the Enlightenment, but they're also in the shadow of the Reformation and, of course, the wars of religion. So that's something I always like to point out as well. So again, a lot of variety in that generation, but they also have a good historical grasp, which I wish more of our politicians would have today. And that's where later we can talk about the humanities, but I just wanted to kind of point that out.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the first president, George Washington. What should we still think about? What's still relevant about his presidency when we're thinking about the presidency today?
Well, yeah, he was endowed with a lot of political power, and of course he stepped down very quietly near the end of his career to go back to Mount Vernon. And I think, of course, that set a precedent for the presidents, right, which became later the two-term tradition. Which wasn't really formalized. Which amendment was it? The 22nd in what, 1951 or 53?
51.
51, yeah. That's after in reaction to FDR's four terms elected. But again, the fact that he stepped down from power when he could have stayed on, that's an important precedent. Although I always like to point out, I have to give a lot of credit to John Adams. After the first really contested election, he stepped down quietly, too, after Jefferson took over in 1800. So that's another important precedent we tend to forget about. But I think that's one clear thing is what became the two-term tradition and going back to civilian life. It's not a lifetime appointment or long-term appointment. Dr.
Yeah, I think it's just like being in Oklahoma, when you're a Sooner, when you get there first, you get to decide what this is going to be about. So Washington has this unique distinction of holding that position. He appointed more judges than anyone because he was the first. He had to fill up the courts, and so he has an unfair advantage in that space. But I just think Washington should get tremendous credit because he established so many things that are not mentioned in the Constitution by name or by even concept. The idea might exist, but we've kind of evolved them over time. So things like executive orders, which have become controversial in recent years, but every president has exercised them since the time of Washington because they're never mentioned, but the take care clause in Article 2 is the clause that requires that the president enforce the law. Well, there's no specific mechanism by which to do that. So Washington simply argued the right to do it. Well, he's George Washington. He's going to argue with this guy. And I think we were very fortunate that we had a consensus candidate. And I'll go out on a limb here. I don't think we've had a consensus candidate for president in this country since Ronald Reagan. One that really could win Massachusetts and Texas, and California and New York. He could win these coalitions. Didn't mean everybody agreed with him, but he win by significant margins. Washington was that kind of guy, and when he did things, people generally, there were some exceptions, like the Jay Treaty we could talk about that were controversial, but for the most part, people just said, yeah, we should do what he says. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue of religious pluralism. Washington should get a lot of credit for, if your listeners, I would encourage them to look up this story of Washington's treatment, not treatment, but his letter that he wrote to the, it's called the Hebrew Congregation at Newport, Rhode Island. And it's called the Truro Synagogue is the name. And it's a synagogue still in operation, and there's an active synagogue there, active congregation. And Washington, long story short, he took a kind of a victory tour of all the states after he was elected. And Rhode Island was the last state that he visited because they were the last to ratify. And he went there immediately after that as kind of a thank you for doing this, and you're not going to regret this kind of thing. We got everybody on board. And when he was there, he was met by various religious groups, and one of the groups that met him was some people from this Jewish congregation. And he soon wrote back letters of thank you for all of the hospitality he received when he got back to New York, which was the capital at the time. And this original letter that he wrote is still there. It's still valued by the members of this congregation. But the very fact that Washington treated this Jewish congregation as an equal with all of the other groups that you mentioned was, we talk about precedents that the president establishes. That was extremely unpopular with some people. And Washington basically reiterated in the letter that these people, you guys are U.S. citizens. I will always, maintain your rights. You have the same rights as anyone. And basically anyone who was going to express an opinion contrary to that would have to take on George Washington. So for all of, again, the founders aren't perfect, and people like to always into these caveats, but I think that's the type of thing that Washington did. He did it so well, and he used his imprimatur and the office of president to say this is going to be a country that recognizes religious tolerance and pluralism at a time when that was not always the case for Jews in the United States. So I've always appreciated that he did that type of thing, and I think that helped to bring the country together, and it made the president look powerful. He was this man who was uniting all of this people. We're going to have this religiously pluralistic country.
We forget how contentious the 1790s were, the development of two-party system, which again was not anticipated by the Constitution per se. And he was ready to retire near the end. Even, of course, he was lambasted by political enemies as much as being supported by others. Another thing I want to mention about Washington, he was very self-conscious, like I think many of the other founders, being kind of students of history, especially the classical world, of their legacy. So they're kind of always looking over their shoulder. I think he was conscious of that, trying to, what's my place in history? How will I be viewed later? I think he has a sense kind of mission as well. What's my long-term legacy? And what we're kind of getting at here too, these traditions, kind of what we call our unwritten Constitution. We mentioned, as Dr. Mason mentioned, we have the issue of religious pluralism. We talked about the two-term tradition. And of course, holding cabinet meetings, that's not found in the Constitution. It becomes a tradition. I know, Dr. Mason, you've mentioned senatorial courtesy.
Yeah, senatorial courtesy was something Washington created, which is when you have a vacancy in a federal court, like a U.S. district court or a circuit court. The president. This is a tradition Washington established. There's no requirement in the Constitution. But the president, it's sometimes called the blue slip procedure, but the president will go to the two senators from the state in which the vacancy occurs and will ask them if they have any recommendations regarding who should fill that position. And, hopefully there can be some agreement there on who they want to pick. And if they can, the president can then go to the full Senate and say, hey, I've already obtained the consent of the senators from this state, so it'll help make the process easier. But the point is that Washington was trying to respect the independence of the Senate and the power that they had, and every president has followed that tradition since. So,
and another tradition too. I know we talked about executive orders. That started up. And then State of the Union. If I recall, did he address the Congress in person? So that kind of started that tradition. Now, technically, all you have to do is submit a written report. So I know that came up more recently when we had the government shut down. So, but technically, all you'd have to do is submit the written report. But this idea, I think Wilson kind of revitalized that in the early 20th century of actually being present before the Congress. Because it's a great opportunity with mass media, right, to make
how it changes
reach
over
out.
time.
We can talk about the technology issue later, communications, but definitely he started that too.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, again, this idea of how the presidency would get started, that was the reason why Washington and Adams, who were federal, well, Washington never joined the party, but Washington and Adams were both Federalists for all intents and purposes. And they saw no problem in addressing the Congress as the president. But Jefferson comes in, he says, well, we have to. In fact, Jefferson's real objection was that he felt like the speech was similar to the speech called the Speech from the Throne, which the monarch always gives at the opening of Parliament every session. And so Jefferson, always cognizant of this, perhaps even hyper-conscious of this concern of appearing like a monarch, which is ironic for a guy who ensconced himself at Monticello and lived like a monarch sometimes. But he was always concerned with that appearance. And so he discontinued that. It pretty much remained unpracticed that way until Wilson.
And I wonder, too, sometimes with Jefferson, he was not, again, we forget this, too. Historically, we talk about personalities. He was not a great great public
wasn't a great
speaker
time.
either. You kind of wonder if that ties in, but you're definitely right in that regard. But yeah, so this unwritten Constitution, that things are not found. Even Madison, when he was taking notes at the convention, he was very conscious. He kept those notes
Secret.
pretty much secret until after his death in 1836. So almost 50 years go by. Let these institutions settle in. Kind of the connecting webs between the institutions, between the lines of the Constitution, how to create, a more stable government. Let those foundations become more settled before you kind of reveal the backroom deals and cigars. All the deal making that had to go on. So Washington was very conscious of that too. So, but yeah, many different precedents were set. In this unwritten Constitution. And part of our unwritten Constitution would also include the Declaration of Independence. Everybody confuses that with the Constitution. We have all these other traditions that have kind of filled in some of those little gaps between the constitutional lines.
Well, speaking of what's in the Constitution, let's talk about what are some key areas, key moments in, let's say, the 19th century where presidential power really expanded. Where do you see that happening, and how did that go down?
Great question. I'll let Dr. Nash, you go ahead, and I'll add.
Well, I always point to President Polk. No one ever. He's everybody's favorite president, of course. But James K. Polk, he's a standard item.
President who? Yes.
Yeah, who's this guy? Yeah. Well, but I think Polk actually expands the. What's the word I want to look for? The kind of the presidency on the international stage, because it's the first time you can count the War of 1812. We did send troops into Canada, British Canada, in the War of 1812, but really the Mexican War is the first time the U.S. troops. We even have a major naval amphibious assault on the city of Veracruz. It's just the United States going abroad. Okay, we don't think of it that way, but it is. It was an entirely different country, and Polk in large measure.
We're talking 1840s.
Yes, correct. Yeah, thank you. 1846 to 1848. And Polk, in large measure, directed the war like a modern president. Now, he, of course, had field commanders. He had General Taylor, General
Winfield
Scott. Thank you, Winfield Scott. And there was a lot of politicking going on with those guys. Between Polk he was only running as a one-term president. He even said that. He announced he'd be a one-term president. But I just point this out that it kind of is reminiscent of what you see today with a modern president dealing with military commanders in the field and having them deployed abroad. It was a very new thing for us. And that's why the war was so controversial on so many levels for good reason. It was a departure from the way we saw the president conducting a war abroad.
Was it beyond what the Constitution even allowed the president to do in some ways?
I don't know if it would. I don't know if you could say that, but because it's so vague, he is the commander in chief and all that. But it certainly violated the traditional roles that we saw. So I certainly Polk, in some sense, everybody always says Lincoln, of course, and I think there's some truth in that. I mean, Lincoln suspends habeas corpus rights, and he he definitely plays loose with certain interpretations of the law, like I always talk about with students in class this issue about being a prisoner of war. Well, how can you call Confederates prisoner of war when they don't represent foreign countries? But part of the reason why Lincoln did that was because he wanted to hold them, part of the reason, in prisoner of war camps without the benefit of due process. So they couldn't challenge the legality of their arrest. They didn't have habeas corpus rights and all these things. So, but I think those are examples of the 18th century. But, and again, we talk about the expansive power. That in itself is somewhat subjective, because what presidents do at one time becomes normal later. And so whether we're talking about Jackson and his behavior with the bank, he vetoes the bank, and then he takes the deposits of the national bank and puts them in the state banks. And, the whole idea of a national bank was controversial still at the time, at least as far as Jackson was concerned. Today we have the Fed. We don't question the president's right to appoint these guys to the Fed and have some control over. So I suppose it's somewhat subjective.
And then, of course, as we move into the 20th century, we've got the two world wars. If you think of Wilson, World War One, that includes censorship, and, of course, the German Americans and some of those communities were kind of put on the spot. And then, of course, World War II with the Japanese internment with FDR. We see continuing growth of the presidency during that time. It kind of sets the mold for the modern presidency. And then I'd like to mention even the Cold War, of course, the That's going to transform the presidency too, because of course the immediacy later of nuclear weapons and missiles. You have quicker decision making. But we've talked about the space race. I know Dr. Mason and I were talking about JFK setting the initiative for getting us on the moon within a decade. We did that within about 8 years, less than 8 years, so within a decade. So that's certainly important. I think another turning point in the growth of the presidency. Of course, we had a backlash to some of that, what we call the imperial presidency. What was it, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. came up with that. We had a little bit of a backlash to that after Vietnam and Watergate. But we see kind of a revival of a stronger, if you want to call it imperial presidency tradition, since 9/11 also. And that continues to this day. And of course, even backtracking a little bit, of course, the civil rights movement, can't forget Eisenhower and desegregation, enforcing some of the court rulings there. So we see a number of these developments taking place that we kind of take for granted today for executive decision making.
Dr. Mason, you said people don't really remember Polk these days. I have a great quote from Harry Truman, who really admired Polk, apparently, because Polk regularly told Congress to go to hell on foreign policy matters. So there's a precedent.
There you go. And Harry Truman was the kind of guy that loved to do that. Yeah, he's one of my, actually Truman's one of my favorite. I love Harry Truman.
I want to get to your favorites later on. But.
He ranks up there. He's just...
Okay. I love the quote from him that said, they say I give him hell, but I just tell them the truth, and they think it's hell.
Yeah.
That sounds like him.
And speaking of Truman, too, I know we talked about late 40s with, with the labor strikes and so forth, enforcement, or Truman stepping in, or desegregation of the military. Truman is also part of these very important precedents being set.
Truman represents, and I say this with all due respect to FDR, who I think was also a great president, but FDR got away with a lot of things that Truman couldn't, and so whether it's the internment of Japanese Americans, which was upheld by the court, and people are always quick to point out, well, the court wasn't ruling on the detention; they were only ruling on the exclusionary rule, which allowed the government to impose curfews. It doesn't matter. The court essentially upheld the right of the Roosevelt administration because they didn't order them to be freed. Truman tried to do much less during the Korean War. He tried to seize a steel mill in the famous, it's called the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer case of 1952. Truman seized a steel mill by the Department of Commerce because there was a labor dispute between management and labor. And he basically kind of said, well, I have the right to do this because we have these emergency powers, and it's during the Korean War, and the Supreme Court basically said, well, they didn't say this, but they basically said, well, you're not Teddy, you're not Roosevelt, you don't get to do this. They were basically saying it's a limited emergency, it's not World War II. We're gonna put the kibosh on this, basically. But I think it had a lot to do with the fact that certainly it was a limited emergency, and all that's true. But I wonder sometimes the role that personality plays when we talk about the presidency. People just have an affinity for certain presidents, and I think certain presidents can get away with more.
So it depends on what your definition of emergency is.
It has a lot to do with that, and that's a fair thing to say, too, because the Korean War was a different war. I don't think the court was wrong to correct Truman in that way, but it was fair for Truman to say, hey, I'm the president now. The last guy got to do this stuff, and why can't I do it? And
you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, the other Roosevelt, real quickly, too, also kind of establishing, with the early 20th century with...
there was a coal strike between labor and management, and he threatened to bring the army in. Roosevelt said, I'll nationalize the coal industry if labor and management can't resolve this, because coal was so important for people. And they said, well, you can't do this. And he said, well, no, I can do this. I'm the president. And it probably would have been unconstitutional, I would agree, but his point was that the people were suffering, and it was his job, under the stewardship theory, as he always promoted it, Teddy Roosevelt, to act as a steward on behalf of the people, and he was not going to let. And fortunately, he did not have to do that. The strike was reached, but I think it was reached largely because of his personality. He just went in and said, "Y'all better take care of this, or I will." And you're not going to. Neither one of you are going to be happy with the outcome.
Then, along with the Food and Drug Administration, those precedents too, stepping in with working conditions. You think of the muckrakers and so forth, and some of that. So he's another one we should mention as well, definitely.
So again, is that an expansion in a bad way? Well, I don't know. It's not for me to say. Certainly, we don't want to see people's civil liberties, diminish. None of us want that. But I go back to Lincoln. Lincoln is hailed as the savior of the country. All those things are correct about him. I'm a great proponent of Abraham Lincoln's memory in a positive way, but in a pure sense of the law, you can question some of them, sure.
Well, I hope this isn't too philosophical of a question, but it seems like the presidents that we typically see as the greatest are the ones who successfully expanded the powers of the office, and they expanded it at the expense of Congress and the courts in some ways. So Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, both Roosevelts. But Americans on both sides of the ideological aisle have kind of a long-standing distrust of centralized power. How do we reconcile that?
Well, I know the issue, especially national emergencies and wartime especially, people want security, but then how much security can you provide without taking away some of the liberties? And I know that's an issue that comes up time and again. But I know we've talked about this too, Dr. Mason, a little bit too, is that, of course, there have been a number of times where there has been some backlash to attempts by the executive to assert himself, and we mentioned the Supreme Court attempt to pack the Supreme Court under FDR back in the 30s.
An idea that's floating around now.
Yeah,
too.
there you go too. There you go, exactly. So you'll have sometimes a pushback there, but I know, Dr. Mason, we've talked about with the issue of federalism too being an important thing in containing that tendency towards centralization. So we do have some mechanisms set up, at least to try to kind of blunt some of that centralization or move towards single authority.
Just as an aside too about what the people want versus what the people get, and also what people say they want versus what they may say what they want later. It's interesting how the opinion polls of the presidents have worked out. The top 5 presidents are routinely Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and oftentimes Franklin Roosevelt will get in there. The 4th and 5th slots are sometimes fluid, but those are generally the ones that we look at. Now, when you look at those 5 presidents, both Roosevelts, Jefferson, Washington, and Lincoln, of those, only one comes from humble origins. Now, I'm going to try to relate it to what you're talking about here. But we have this, Robert Dahl talks about the myth. He's a presidential writer. He talks about the myth of the presidential mandate. Well, there's also the myth of the log cabin. And a lot of presidents portray themselves as humble and all that because it's American to want to rise from the lower classes and all the lower poor people, all this. At the end of the day, Lincoln's the only one in that top 5 that can be legitimately counted that way. And so here's the point. People say they want a president that is humble, common person, just like them, but the ones we rank the highest are those who are actually aristocrats. And so I don't pretend to have a perfect answer as to why that is, but it seems like the aristocrats are the better presidents. I call it maybe the Mr. Burns effect from The Simpsons, right? He's the evil autocrat. He's you all will do what I tell you and all this stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, he's walking around with his hands like that. But it seems to be the case that we tend to like. So not only do we like the ones who expand the presidency, which is true, and I think Dr. Schmaltz is right that sometimes, and it's fair to say, in times of emergency, you need more rule. You need more direct control. You need more centralization.
Yeah,
but there's
decisions by committee.
It's a very American decision, though, to decentralize power. But I think that for some reason we do tend to like these presidents, although Lincoln's a notable exception. One other thing to say about this. It's true, the myth of the log cabin to a certain extent, but there are a number of presidents who have come from that background. So Lincoln, James Garfield. We've had presidents who were so poor they were at the bottom level of society in terms of socioeconomic. So
Andrew Johnson had been an indentured servant.
Andrew Johnson was an indentured who broke his indenture because he didn't like how he was being treated.
Bill Clinton came from
Bill Clinton, very humble origins. President Reagan, his father
Mm-hmm.
was an alcoholic, couldn't hold a job very well. I mean,
Nixon too. Even.
Nixon, common, So it's fair to say, and I don't because I think we can It's like everything else. We have to approach everything with a moderate concern, but I think sometimes we can go too far the other way. And then we've had presidents, the Bush family, wealthy people, very wealthy people of privilege. The Kennedys the same way. President Kennedy, those people never had to worry about how they were going to pay the rent. And that's nothing bad against them. It's just we've had aristocratic presidents, we've had poor presidents. We tend to rank those higher. It's interesting. Now, who knows? In 200 years, maybe the trend will reverse. But Washington himself is called the indispensable man. We frame him in that discussion, and I think Washington labored to while that was true, he was indispensable at the time. He was trying to wean the country off of himself, knowing that the country would have to go on. I'm glad you mentioned the election of 1800 because people thought we were going to degenerate into bloodshed, but we didn't. So, so we have to establish those precedents. But we seem to like those aristocratic precedents.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Arthur Schlesinger earlier. Schlesinger, and his 1973 book was called "The Imperial Presidency," and it argued that the presidency was out of control and had exceeded its constitutional limits. I think he was particularly looking at war powers, right?
That's right. That was the year it came
War
out.
Powers Act.
70s.
Yeah, exactly. It all comes out of that post-Viet.
So, is it fair to say that the founders really couldn't have envisioned America fighting the kind of wars we fought down the road, and that the presidency would need to assume more powers? Or
I'd say it depends on the founder. If it's Alexander Hamilton, Hamilton talked about creating an empire into Latin America today, what we call Latin America. But overall, I think that's fair. I think most of the presidents, particularly if you go like with Jefferson, even Washington, Washington advised strict neutrality with the wars between France and England at the time of his presidency. I think for the most part that's the case. But you have a handful of founders that were perhaps willing to allow presidential power to expand further.
Like I said, with technology too, we've mentioned in the 20th century, especially as you have to make quicker decisions. It's easier to have one person do it than 535 or 538 today. And so that's certainly a factor as some of the national crises change, right? The speed of which you have to decide, which again is another matter I may want to talk about later when we look at the humanities, what role that can play in decision making. Again, since 1900, we've seen that tendency, that trend leading towards greater centralization. And if you think about it, in Congress, we have not had an official declaration of war since about 1942. That was against the minor Axis powers like Finland, Hungary, and Romania. We've had resolutions after that. But we think of the police action, Korea, Vietnam. You had the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. We've had resolutions in the wars on terror and so forth. It's interesting that the responsibility even though Congress may kind of sanction it, they don't officially declare it. So the president kind of assumes that mantle. So it's an interesting trend or maybe a disturbing trend in some cases where you have the Congress kind of delegate. But that may be the nature of national security threats. And again, I go back to the Cold War. When you started having the potential of a thermonuclear war and strikes through interballistic, continental missiles here, you may only have 20 or 30 minutes to decide, right, for a first strike or for a response. So, again, you have that mechanism set up where you kind of rely on the executive. So, technology and the nature of the crises may affect how we, delegate that authority. So, we see a greater trend towards, the executive branch there.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point to say that most of them didn't envision it. And that's why I bring up Polk. It's interesting, Polk kind of leading this war on foreign soil and this type of thing. But yeah, technology is the big issue. I believe, I could be wrong, I think Coolidge was the first president to be able to address on radio in a broad fashion most of the country. I don't think the founders could have. I always say Benjamin Franklin. I see the quote of him up there. He's always the notable. There's always a notable exception to almost anything, right? And he's the notable exception when it comes to technology. Franklin might have envisioned the idea that you could have mass technology. Of course, he was a mass media guy. He had made his money through the mail, right? Selling his publications, but. The idea, I think, again, we see it as kind of a quaint notion. We don't really, I think, grasp in the 21st century the significance of the ability of the president to have us, because since he's a singular actor, he's not like the Congress. He's not one of 100 in the Senate or one of 435. He is singular. He is an individual. And he can get on the radio, he can get on TV, and people can not just hear, they can
get on Twitter.
Him. He can get on Twitter.
He can Twitter
when he's
today is
doing whatever.
I kind of call Twitter the modern day fireside chat with FDR, which was very innovative in the early 30s, mid 30s, to reach out directly to the people.
It just expands his power so much in ways that. So it's a great question you ask. I don't know if they could have fully given the technology that we have today.
Exactly.
Yeah. And presidents can use that power for however they wish.
Yeah.
For
better for worse.
For better for worse, like anything else. And so that's why it's important, who we elect and go back to civics and humanities and how we educate ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't want to harp on the founders too much or bash the founders for any lack of foresight or anything, but I wanted to ask about, like, if we look at what some people have called our wars of survival, our most important wars in our history, like let's say the Civil War and World War II, real existential threats.
Yeah.
The United States probably had its greatest wartime leaders in those two wars.
Exactly.
Can we give much credit to the constitutional design for that, or was it just dumb luck? Is it just dumb luck that George Washington ended up being?
That's a great question.
Yeah,
that was a great question.
We were brainstorming on that one.
I should probably cite you because I'm thinking about bringing that in my presidency class. That's a great question, and I feel embarrassed that I never thought about that.
I kind of think it's a combination of both, or a number of variables. And what was that one quote? Dr. Burlingame, he has a guest speaker. He's a noted Lincoln biographer and historian, now retired. But I know, what was that one quote that he gave us? I'm not sure who it's attributed to, but Dr. Burlingame, what was it with the luck issue? But he had a great quote that he used.
Dr. Burlingame said that God tends to smile on drunks, fools, and the United States of America.
Oh.
And we wholheartedly embraced that when we heard that, and I think it's applicable here.
And it may be a little bit of luck, being in the right place at the right time, and maybe because some may see it as being providential or something else. But I do think it's also tied in with our system. I know, Dr. Macy, we were talking a little bit about Lincoln in particular, just the timing, but it's also tied in with political circumstances. That does tie in with our constitutional system. I'll let the poli-sci guy.
Well, there's one thing that came to mind when you said that. Lincoln, and I have to go check the exact numbers, but Lincoln was elected with, I believe, right at 40% of the popular votes. Now, of course, he was running at such an auspicious time, but he was also running against four candidates. Right, there's four major candidates running, and so they split the popular vote. Had we gone to popular vote, it's very possible Lincoln might not have been elected. It was the Electoral College that made Lincoln president. So sometimes we hear and there are legitimate conversations that can be had about the Electoral College, as we talked about at Curiosity Fest last year, and which was a great time. Encourage people to come out to the one this year is it October? Is that right?
Yeah, we'll have some more information about Curiosity Fest coming up in the next few months.
Encourage people to come out to that, but that was the topic that we covered last year in my session. But in that sense, you can say the Electoral College provided Lincoln to the country because his margin of victory was exaggerated, as it's supposed to. The Electoral College is designed to, but he only had 40% of the vote. And if we were going to it's possible, to be fair, you could say, well, they could have had, if there was a system for runoff and all that, but the country was so splintered, I think it needed a winner at that moment. And fortunately, it was Abraham Lincoln. It was not John Bell or Douglas or one of these other guys. And so
the perception of a mandate was there thanks to the...
Yeah, exactly. So, in FDR's case, you can think of things like Huey Long. He was assassinated
1935,
and he was a rival because he was trying to push Roosevelt further to the left, and Roosevelt was not a radical. He was not, maybe by some people's measure, but he was a very decent man. I think he was trying to do what was best for the country, and he was pragmatic. He was trying new things, and so not that I rejoice in the death of Huey Long, but you say, what would happen if he had lived? What if he had? I believe, and this just off the top of my head, didn't Bill Moyers do for PBS years ago? Didn't he do a program called The Dictator and the Democrat? I
don't know.
I believe I could be wrong on that, but I
can't remember.
Your listeners may good, and I may be totally wrong. I thought he was the one that narrated it, but I thought it was a program for PBS, and it basically followed the actions of Hitler and FDR.
Oh yeah,
and it talks about that. Could be wrong with the title. I apologize if I'm not right on that, but it was years ago I saw it. And it just talked about this very thing, about how fortunate we were that we didn't go down the road of Germany. Well, I think it was the Constitution that protected us. Because when FDR made mistakes, like trying to pack the court, the other branches, and to their credit, the Democrats in Congress said, no, we won't let you do that. They
were the majority.
You're going too far. And they didn't choose partisanship. They chose the Constitution, loyalty to that, not to him.
Institutional loyalty.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe it's a combination.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's a great question.
And by the way, the irony is with Roosevelt, FDR, is that third term, he probably would have stepped down, but then the war clouds were looming in 30. See, he would have been reelected in 1940, so that kind of gave some impetus to him being willing to run for a third term, which, of course, was not always popular with everybody, of course, but ironically, the dangers made that also another factor why he stayed on.
And the people ratified the choice.
And they ratified
They ratified
the choice.
And every time they were given a choice, same with Lincoln in 1864. That's why I say I don't want anybody to think when they hear this that I'm running Lincoln down, because Lincoln's, I think his greatest thing that he did was he submitted to popular election in 1864. He said, no, we have to maintain this. If we do this, we've lost the whole point. And Lincoln got 75% of the soldiers' vote.
Wow.
Is the amount we think.
In 1864.
In 1864.
Wow.
And I've always said what a debt the country owes to those guys. They all knew that Lincoln was committed to bludgeoning the South to finish the war in 64 and 65, and they knew they were going to be sent right into that maelstrom. And they volunteered for that. And
that's a great point.
I really mean that. The country owes those guys a great debt.
Wow, that's amazing. I never heard that.
They knew they would be, but they were the guys saying here and now, let it happen. So
I was going to say, a while back,
people.
Dr. Mason, you referred to a quote that's on the wall of our podcast studio here. It's a quote from Benjamin Franklin. It says, "I didn't fail the test. I just found 100 ways to do it wrong." I feel like that's a comment about me as a podcast host. I'm trying not to take that too personally.
That's the eternal optimist.
Only 100 ways? Yeah.
Just 100.
Well, here's a quote I found from John Steinbeck about the American presidency that I just want to run by you guys so you think about it. He said, "We give the president more work than a man can do, more responsibility than a man should take, more pressure than a man can bear." So are our expectations for what the American president should do, are they even realistic? Can a president be a strong leader and still respect the will of Congress and the courts and recognize kind of the general mistrust of centralized government of our citizens? Is this a realistic office these days even?
No.
That's an easy answer.
No, it's more than that. Yeah. But I know we were kind of thinking about the presidency too. Sometimes you're only as good as the people around you, but it's about the issue of delegating authority. And I know, Dr. Mason, we've talked in different venues over the years about pragmatic politicians versus ideologues.
Yes.
And so, but also the people around you, that's very important too, because no one person can do it all, especially in more complex societies today, like we've talked about. So I think we are unrealistic, relying on one person. And of course, that even goes back to the debates about what should the presidency be like. Should we have one at all? Should we have one president? Should we have three presidents? Should it be a 4-year term, 6-year term? Lifetime term? Should we have a foreign policy president and a domestic president
an
at the same time?
An offensive coordinator and a defensive coordinator.
Exactly. So, but it is a lot for one person. And I don't envy any president. I don't care what political perspective they come from. That is a huge burden. I mean, as we know, a whole lifetime they practically go through. They age.
The aging.
But we are unrealistic, perhaps, especially I think in the modern media age, especially. But that's kind of my impression as well.
I think I wasn't aware of that quote by Steinbeck, and I feel bad because I like Steinbeck's work.
I never run across it either.
I'm not familiar with it, but I think it's very true. And I think you're absolutely right. The best presidents are those who delegate, and you're only as good as the people around you. And a great example of that is with the Teapot Dome scandal, and with President Harding, I guess it was.
Oh yeah, early 20s.
Yeah. I mean, and Grant's even a better example. I should say Grant, who was a very honest guy, but he had Grant's a better example. I should say
that's a good. Yeah,
Harding probably had his own problems.
Had some other issues.
He was very negotiable on what's right and wrong. I think.
Yeah,
it's always a matter of what's at the moment. But Grant was a very decent guy, but he had probably the most corrupt administration because he did not screen these guys well. But that's his fault. He's in charge, and so
the buck stops there.
The buck stops with Harry Truman.
Right.
That's it. That's a Trumanism. So, at the end of the day, I think that, and also you're absolutely right. They're not ideologues. The best presidents aren't ideologues. They're
flexible.
They're flexible.
We think of Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase, and again, he didn't abolish all the Federalist legislation either. He modified it, but. Yeah. Jefferson also was pragmatic enough, especially once he got into office, he could kind of sit back and say, "Oh, this isn't so bad." Even maybe railed against it before.
The worst presidents are those who cannot admit they make a mistake. The American public will forgive people for all kinds of things.
Yeah,
I think at heart we are good people. We're generous people. We believe. our Constitution permits the president to pardon criminals, which I completely support. It's a good thing, and when it's used wisely, and it has been used wisely at different times, like the pardoning of people after rebellions and things like that to heal the country. Washington used it in the Whiskey Rebellion, things like that.
So that's why it should be used. Do you think?
I think that's a very good, legitimate use of it. In the Whiskey Rebellion, for example, when you pardon these people, they didn't have the power to overthrow the government once they were disarmed, and you kind of take that power away from them when the government says, "Okay, we're going to let you go," because you're ranting against the government. It's so bad, it's so against you, it's out to get you. Well, just let me go. Well, it kind of takes the wind out of my sails, But my favorite example of Lincoln doing that was what was called the Trent Affair in 1862, when Lincoln found out that John Mason and John Slidell, they were both Confederate commissioners that were trying to represent the Confederacy abroad, and they were on a HMS ship, Her Majesty's ship. I always point to Her Majesty, Queen Victoria. And they were on a mail ship. It was a military mail ship that was taking parcels and posts across the Atlantic from Canada back and forth. And Lincoln found out about it, and he said, "Hey, put a man on those guys." And so they sent a U.S. naval vessel to interdict it, and it did. It stopped a British. Well, we got to remember this is 1862 when Britain rules the waves. And the U.S. Navy's good, but it's probably not that good. And it stops a British ship, and it demands turn these guys over. And they did. They took them, and then they went on their merry way and back to England, and our guys came back here, and Lincoln was going to imprison them. And Queen Victoria found out about this, and boy, she was not a happy camper. How dare you do this to my free commerce of my empire? And if I want these boys to come over here, I will have them come over here. And Lincoln quickly had them released, and he said, "One war at a time." Because Queen Victoria, in response to that, she immediately dispatched 10,000 British troops to Canada. She was not fooling around. And so he knew that, whoa, this is not... And he said, "One war at a time." And so the best presidents do that. The worst thing you can do is not admit it. Just... And I don't know if that's ego, if that's hubris, or if they're trying to accomplish something else in the meantime. I guess it depends on the situation. But
are there any other qualities that come to mind that you would say are the president should possess? Great qualities.
Well, so you mentioned pragmatism, flexibility.
There's a really good book I would encourage listeners to read if they're interested in this. It's by Thomas Cronin and Michael Genovese, and it's a dated book. It's probably at least 20 years old. Although I'm sure it's such a good book, I'm sure it's in subsequent editions by now. But it's called The Paradoxes of the American Presidency. And Dr. Cronin and Dr. Genovese are both really well respected in this regard. And they make the point that successful presidents are able to navigate paradoxes. And they identify, I think it's 9 or 10 paradoxes in the book. And one of them is we always want a kind, compassionate, understanding president, but we also respect those who are cunning, manipulative, and ruthless. And that's true. And I think Abraham Lincoln's a great example of that. Lincoln has just been absolutely inundated with stories of his compassion and how kind he was. He was a very decent man.
Yeah, I have a children's book. My daughter's 7, and we have a children's book that is about how Lincoln saved turtles as a young man. He loved turtles.
He was an animal lover. He was a
saint. Yeah.
Yes, he was one of the first guys to call early on to call for animal cruelty laws. He supported. He would be very much a fan of the ASPCA today. He supported things like seeing alcoholics as people who needed treatment rather than just being evil or weak. He was very modern on those things. But Lincoln was also the kind of guy that could take very hard stances towards things that when you look at them, you realize the misery you're causing. A great example was the prisoner exchanges that he, in 1864, 63 and 64, they broke down, and he refused to exchange prisoners with the Confederacy. And the primary reason they had up until that point, the primary reason was because the South needed them. The numerical advantage the North possessed. Every time you exchanged a Confederate soldier, it helped the South immeasurably, but the North didn't need their guys back. And so there's no doubt there were thousands of men who died at places like Andersonville who should have been exchanged by virtue of being prisoners of war, but Lincoln understood that if they stay there, it will help shorten the war. So he was ruthless. He had to make that decision. That doesn't make him bloodthirsty, doesn't make him bad, but he could say, you're going to have to die so we can win.
And there were some Americans, relatives of those prisoners of war, who never forgave him
Oh,
for
never.
that either. So
Never.
we forget that it wasn't all unanimous.
Huh.
And I think of FDR with Lend-Lease, in 1940, being cunning, and but again, he's anticipating the next move as the war clouds gather. So that wasn't always popular with
And
Congress.
Lincoln, more than likely, it was Lincoln that maneuvered Jefferson Davis into firing the first shot. Because he sent a relief ship, and he said, "You're going to shoot at a relief ship to Fort Sumter that's full of supplies. There's no soldiers on it. You guys are going to do this." And Jefferson Davis, he kind of manipulated him into it. And that's a guy you don't want to play poker with.
We might have to do a 10-part series on Lincoln. We could talk about Lincoln all day.
He's great. He's a great guy.
I did want to ask, I wish we weren't running out of time, but I wanted to ask real quick
Sure.
how you might see the presidency evolving in future decades. Could you see other branches of the other branches of the government maybe taking back some of the power or is that impossible? I don't know.
Of course, with the rise, the expansion of bureaucracies, they become kind of a fourth branch. That's maybe one thing is lurking in the background. But I know that's a great question. I've been thinking about that, especially now with the next election cycle already beginning. We have a number of candidates, especially on the Democratic side right now. We got a wide variety of people. Will we have a woman president? Of course, we had Obama, African American. Will we have someone from very different background? I mean, there's some different options that may be coming down the road here, and of course, the conservatives as well as liberals are open to having their own female candidate if that person's qualified. So I think we've opened up some new opportunities for different participants. So we may be talking about some really new options in that regard. Also, I kind of wonder too, with Twitter, also the more immediate outreach to constituents, it's much more direct even than what you had with radio or television. You don't have as much of that filtering process. So technology is going to be an interesting, especially social media. You think of Trump, but this is starting, both parties will quickly adapt to that. So I think that may be another factor to consider as the immediacy of their public relations. I don't know, Dr. Macy, wanted to add to that.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. The technology is the big issue. And, we've knocked down a lot of these social barriers that once existed. I thought it was interesting when Romney ran, no one talked about the fact that we'd had the first person from the LDS church run.
That's a good point, yeah.
And I thought that was as transformative as some people it's maybe not as dramatic, but as even with the anti-Catholic bias that existed in this country, up until even after the election of Kennedy.
Al Smith in the 20s.
Al Smith
and Kennedy.
I mean, you think of the LDS Church, where there was actually an extermination order issued by the governor of Missouri to kill every LDS member in the state.
In was it
1830?
Okay.
I believe 1834, 35. I mean, just crazy. And now this man is going to run for president. So those are always good things when we leave prejudice behind, when we leave...
Joe Biden as the vice presidential candidate for Gore, right? Jewish,
sure,
American.
Yeah.
Lieberman.
We forget that, too.
Joe Lieberman.
That would have been almost unthinkable, almost, just a few decades earlier.
So I think those are things we can look forward to, as the country, sheds some of those inhibitions that it once had and those prejudices. That's always a good thing. But, the role of technology is significant. I don't know... People so much smarter than me, which is not saying much, but people saying so much smarter than me are inventing new things every week, and my son will probably be one of those. He's always figuring out new things to do with his phone, and so I remember Ross Perot back in 1992 talking about, of course, in a very inarticulate way, and I like Ross Perot, God bless him, but he was talking about, maybe we can get people voting with their TVs, right? Remember he was talking about that. We'll have a button we can do this with.
I've got one in my pocket right now. I could vote with.
He's not so crazy. Yeah. Who knows what it's going to be?
Well, there's been some discussion of that too, with having different proposals. I think some of the Democratic candidates have, of course, maybe lowering the voting age. I don't know if that will happen or not, but that's a proposal on the table out there of same-day registration at the national election level. So, I mean, these are things that may further tweak the system. Absolutely.
Yeah, to me, the real question, those are all good. To me, the real question that you made me think of when you said it was the fate of the Electoral College. I wonder as we go, and, there states essentially have the ability to do this at the state level. They can allocate their votes how they want. There's all types of proposals to link it to this or to that, and to effectively go around the arrangement that we have today. That's the real question. And if we do that, there will be some real consequences both ways. Some people will be very happy, some people very unhappy. We'll have to decide as a country. Of course, Jefferson said that we shouldn't have the same Constitution all the time. Jefferson said we're not wedded to it. He was a big fan in the concept of the earth belongs to the living. And he advocated that every 20 or so years we should have a new Constitution. So, it's a fair... Of course, he wasn't part of the deliberations of the document, but people who want to change the Electoral College, I can understand where they're coming from in that regard, in the sense that we're allowed to change it. We have an amendment process, but he even said, it shouldn't even... You don't have the right to bind your descendants to things that you decided. It's a fair question. So, but then there's some very good reasons and pragmatic for keeping it, for national unity and maintaining regional balance and differences among the country. It's worked very well. And Lincoln's an example. So the debate will continue.
We really might do another episode just about the Electoral College.
There we
Actually,
go.
maybe as we get closer to 2020, I'd love to talk more about that.
I'll be curious about that.
Yeah. Well, before I let you guys go, too, I wanted to ask you about, how do you see the role of the humanities in educating our voters and our citizens?
Oh, that's a great question. I know we talked prior to the show about, I consider myself part of the humanities, even though I'm taking over the social sciences department. I certainly have some overlap with social science, especially political science with Dr. Mason, and of course I'll be delegating authority as chair to my departmental members. But I do consider myself part of the liberal arts tradition, humanities. I've always had a feeling, even since high school and college, that we always kind of played second fiddle, especially to the STEM field, which again are very important. We need all these different skills and applications.
It could be STEM. You could put an H
STEM,
in there.
give you a German, STEM. But I always felt that sometimes, even as a European historian, I know sometimes there tends to be kind of a, it's not an intellectual bias, but not as much of an appreciation sometimes for the humanities in American culture. And again, you don't want to have a bunch of elitist academic types, but on the other hand, we're not, we do need some of these traditions that came out of that European tradition in particular. And so I felt that the humanities, again, the word human is in that, the human condition, understanding human motivation, human frailties, human strengths, those are very important. And the humanities came out of the Greco-Roman classical civilization, but it was revived by the Renaissance, the humanist scholars in Italy, the Northern Renaissance humanists as well, who picked up on, the ideas about virtues, about reflection, memory. And ideas have consequences. They're lessons of history. Cultural memory is important. Lessons from the past. And that's very important. I think the humanities offers us that critical thinking tool, and sometimes we tend to forget that because we Americans tend to be very pragmatic, including the applied sciences more than the theoretical. But at any rate, the humanities, sometimes we need to reflect and consider issues, and that includes politics, right? It includes maybe reevaluating our traditions, reevaluating legislation, reevaluating who we are or who we might become, and we need time to do that. And that's one of the things I kind of worry about with social media, and of course our fast-paced world. We don't have time to reflect like we used to. And I know with the 24/7, 365, media culture, and it's tough for any president of any side. I always sympathize. You have to do that press conference every day, whether you're the Obama administration or the Trump. You have to deal with it. And sometimes you don't have time to reflect and to know where you stand. And sometimes maybe you have to make a quick decision. But the humanities offers us some what's the term I want to use? Reflective moments to reconsider and kind of step back a bit. And I think we've lost some of that. And I do worry about that. And again, whether you're in business, you need to know other cultures. If you're overseas, how do you deal with different cultures? When it comes to trade policy, foreign policy, diplomacy, you want to have politicians who are educated, kind of like some of the founders and the framers, right? They have some background on how the world works. You know who you are, but you also know who you're dealing with. And I think the humanities offers that, and I think we've lost some of that appreciation. And so that's kind of my perspective on that. So you want to have different disciplines and areas of life. You want to have politicians who come from different backgrounds, not just the legal tradition, but maybe business, agriculture, the arts and so forth. And I know we tend to have more lawyers than we do some of these other fields, but I think that's part of what the humanities can add, all these different disciplines, including politics. But the humanities are close to my heart, understanding the human condition. Yeah. Dr. Mason, if you want to add to that.
I'm a great fan of science. We need science, but we also need the normative questions answered.
Yeah.
The value questions. We can, science can point us to the how, but not always the why.
Yeah, exactly.
And it can tell us how we can immunize people against smallpox. It can't tell us why it matters.
Exactly.
And I think the why questions matter. And I think the founders would certainly have agreed with it. They were all fans of the classics. And
but the well-rounded individual, both body, mind, and I guess soul.
And also,
context.
It's hard for a society to exist and to be cohesive without common reference points, and that comes from literature. That comes from one of my favorite phrases from John Adams. He would say, "You're never." He told his son John Quincy. He said, "You're never alone with a poet in your pocket." And he always said he carried around a book of either poetry or some literature or something. And these guys would ride on horseback from Braintree, Massachusetts to Philadelphia. And they would read a book. Now, I'm not capable of that.
Jocelyn like books on tape. Books.
I could do that. I could do that. But I mean,
podcasts.
And they were, they were reading, the class. They were reading Virgil, and they were reading sometimes in the original languages, which is just fantastic. These guys were incredibly bright, but they were able. That's one reason they were able to, I think, come up with a form of government that reflects the human condition and has an appreciation for, with its faults, was able to. That's why it's been able to stand so long and last so long.
Very long for a republic. They don't tend to last long.
And I think a legitimate criticism of our culture is that we're so pragmatic. We are so productive. We are so good at, and those are all good things. But we need the reflective moments. We need to ask the why questions.
And one thing I'll just throw out as a world historian, the Chinese tend to think long term. We tend to think more short term. And the pros and cons to both schools of thought, because they've been around so much longer.
They kind of laugh at how young
we're the
we
new kids on the block,
And
Exactly.
the OHC does a lot of good. I'm not prompted. I want to say this. I've done a lot of work with you guys, like with the incarcerated populations here in Oklahoma. I've felt very lucky to get to do that. I've learned a lot from that opportunity, and I think that when these guys that are locked up, it's not just about board. They're trying to exercise their minds. They're seeing that this can be a road to their reclamation, I guess is the word, or their improvement.
To make sense of their life.
And I appreciate that the OHC does that type of work. I think it's very good. It really is, and I think it's paying some dividends in their lives.
Well, thanks for saying that.
It is. It really is true, and other things too. So,
well, we appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much for driving down from Alva.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned elitist academic types. You guys are two of the best examples.
We are prima facie cases.
We have to put up with each other all the time.
Is there anything you wanted to mention about what's going on at Northwestern these days?
Well, we do have coming up on April 23rd. It's a daytime session. We've got a guest speaker coming in from Dickinson State University in North Dakota. It's ranching oil country up there, too. We have a Teddy Roosevelt scholar.
Clay Jenkinson.
I want to make sure you guys... he's a very noted Roosevelt scholar. He'll be presenting on at our annual presidential lecture series. So he'll be giving a talk to the public down there on April 23rd.
Oh, great.
We do that every spring semester.
Thank you again, Dr. Mason and Dr.
Thank you, guys.
Schmaltz.
Thanks for coming in today. Appreciate the help. The sound engineer should get some credit here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, we encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the BrainBox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/BrainBox website, and on social media by using hashtag BrainBoxOK. Please give us a rating. You can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. This has been BrainBox, a podcast for your noggin.